Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. So this lecture is on Cloudwatch, and Cloudwatch is a fundamental part of the SysOps Administrator Associate exam. Basically, it's one of the most important services that you need to understand inside out when going to sit your exam. So we are in the monitoring and reporting section of the course. So we're going to look at Cloudwatch and how we can do monitoring and reporting. So let's start with what Cloudwatch is. Basically, it's a monitoring service to monitor your AWS resources as well as the applications that you run on AWS. And Cloudwatch can monitor things like compute, so it can monitor things like your auto-scaling groups, your elastic load balancers, Route 53 health checks. It can do storage and content delivery, so EBS volume, storage gateway, CloudFront, etc. It can also monitor things like your database and analytics. So these are things like DynamoDB, your Elasticache nodes, RDS instances, your Elastic MapReduce job flows, Redshift, etc. And it can also monitor other things such as SNS topics, SNS queues, OpsWorks, CloudWatch logs, estimated charges on your AWS bills, etc. So the most fundamental important thing to understand going into your exam is what it monitors by default when it comes to EC2, and then what you need custom metrics for. So by default, it monitors these things called host level metrics, and they consist of basically four different things. Three different things from a physical point of view, and then a status check. So the three different things are CPU, network, and disk. So it can monitor things like CPU utilization, or network throughput, or disk I/O, for example. And then it can also monitor the actual health of both the EC2 host as well as the EC2 instance. These are known as status checks. What it can't monitor is things, so if you think about it holistically, it can see the disk as a whole, as a physical piece of hardware. What it can't see is the individual, let's say we go down to the individual virtual disk. It can't see how much storage space is left or is still available. It can't see RAM utilization. It can't see things like that. What it can see is the CPU utilization. It can see the things like the network utilization and the overall disk activity, so the overall disk throughput, but that's where it stops. And then it can also do things like your status checks. So anything else that falls out of CPU, network, disk, or status check is a custom metric. So things like RAM utilization, for example, how much memory is your EC2 instance currently utilizing of which is provisioned to it. And so that is what we call a custom metric. And we will have a lab coming up, which will show you how to monitor this. We're going to use a Perl script to go in and configure it on our EC2 instance. And then we're going to start pushing these metrics to CloudWatch. So just remember going into your exam, if it's not CPU, network, or disk, or the actual status of the EC2 hardware, the EC2 host, as well as the EC2 instance, then it's going to be a custom metric. And you will be tested on this throughout the exam. Also, it's really important to understand how long CloudWatch metrics are stored. You can retrieve data using the Get Metrics Statistic API or by using third-party tools offered by AWS partners. And you can store your log data in CloudWatch logs for as long as you want. By default, CloudWatch logs will store your log data indefinitely. So you can change the retention for each log group at any time. You could just say, okay, for my ELBs, I only want, data for the last 2 weeks. But for my EC2 instances, I want to go all the way back to 6 months. So you can change it, but by default, it is logged indefinitely. And you can also retrieve data from any terminated EC2 or Elastic Load Balancer instance after its termination. So do bear that in mind as well. In terms of metric granularity, it really depends on the AWS service. Many default metrics for many default services are 1 minute, but it could also be 3 minutes or 5 minutes depending on the service. Now you get basically normal monitoring and detailed monitoring. Normal monitoring is every 5 minutes. Detailed monitoring is every 1 minute. And custom metrics, so things like RAM utilization, which we'll see coming up, the minimum granularity that you can have is 1 minute. Now, one important thing to note here is if you have just your default CloudWatch settings on for, like, say, EC2, you're only ever going to get 5 minute data points. That's even if you do have a script that's pushing data to CloudWatch every 1 minute. CloudWatch will actually aggregate that over the 5 minutes. And again, we're going to see that in the lab coming up. In terms of alarms, you can create an alarm to monitor any Amazon CloudWatch metrics in your account, and this can include EC2 CPU utilization, elastic load balancer latency, or even the charges on your AWS bill. And you can set the appropriate thresholds in which to trigger the alarms, and also what kind of action should be taken if an alarm state is reached. And we're going to cover this off in a subsequent lecture, but you could just tell it to send you an SNS notification saying, oh look, I've gone over $10 on my AWS account for this month. Or you could even have it trigger a Lambda function which goes through and just starts deleting all your infrastructure. It's entirely up to you. But CloudWatch alarms can basically trigger an action to be taken, which you would go in and configure. And yeah, it's really, really powerful stuff. So onto my exam tips. Just remember what CloudWatch is. It's a monitoring service to monitor your AWS resources as well as applications that you run on AWS. Your host level metrics always consist of CPU, network, disk, and your status check. If it's asking you about a metric outside of this, such as RAM utilization or even the amount of storage space left on a virtual hard disk, you're going to need custom metrics. So RAM utilization is a custom metric. And remember that for custom metrics, the minimum granularity is 1 minute. Also moving on, terminated instances. You can retrieve data from any terminated EC2 or Elastic Load Balancer instance after its termination, and CloudWatch logs by default are stored indefinitely. And then finally, just remember with your metric granularity, so you have 1 minute for detailed monitoring and 5 minutes for standard monitoring. You may get some scenario-based questions just asking you for 2-minute monitoring, and how would you achieve that? Well, you're going to need to use detailed monitoring rather than standard monitoring. And one thing I didn't really cover off in this lecture, but one thing you should definitely be aware of is that CloudWatch can be used on-premise as well. It's not restricted to just AWS resources. You can definitely use this inside your own data center, and you can have metrics being reported back to your CloudWatch dashboard, inside AWS from your own data center. And the way you do this is you need to download and install the SSM agent, and we will cover SSM in a lot more detail later on in the course. Then once that's installed, you need to download and install the CloudWatch agent. So if you do see any scenarios where it's talking about CloudWatch being on-premise, that is definitely valid. So that is it for this lecture, guys. In the next lecture, we're going to go ahead and start getting our hands dirty with CloudWatch. So if you've got the time, please join me in the next lecture. Thank you.